The first time I saw him, I thought he looked like someone who didn't bleed. The second time, he proved me wrong because it was my heart that started bleeding instead. The sound of New York traffic below was a kind of lullaby. I never asked for sirens. Horns, shouts that climbed the walls of the skyscrapers and broke against the windows of my father's penthouse. I stood there in a suit that didn't fit my shoulders, watching my reflection in the glass and wondering how it had come to this. Being sold off to a man I'd never met, all in the name of family alliances and business deals. Liam. My father's voice cut through the air like a verdict, smooth and absolute. You'll meet Ethan Wright tonight. He's a partner at one of the best law firms in Manhattan. Polished, respected. Exactly the kind of man who'll keep you out of trouble. He meant the kind who'll keep the family name clean. He meant the kind who'll bury who you are. I almost laughed. Trouble was my middle name, and pretending had never been my strong suit. When Ethan Wright walked into the restaurant that night, I swore time hesitated. He was everything I wasn't: orderly, distant, composed. The kind of man whose shoes shined even under dim lighting, whose tie knot was perfect and voice carried authority like a soft blade. I hated him instantly, or maybe I hated that I noticed how his eyes, gray like winter mornings, swept over me not with judgment, but curiosity. So, he said, sitting across from me as the waiter poured wine neither of us wanted. You're the one I'm supposed to marry. His tone was indifferent, almost cruel. Perfect. I could play cruel too. Guess that makes you my lucky prize, I said, raising my glass with a smirk that didn't reach my eyes. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a long time, his gaze too steady, too sharp. Then he said quietly, I don't believe in luck, only choices. And right then, I knew this wasn't going to be simple. I wish I could say I handled it well. But living with Ethan was like sharing an apartment with winter itself. Every corner was neat, every conversation rehearsed. He had rules for everything: no shoes in the living room, no food after 9, no music before work. And me? I was chaos in sneakers, the walking embodiment of 3 a.m. Mistakes. We were oil and water, and yet, somehow, every argument left my heart racing in ways I couldn't name. Why do you care if I'm late? I snapped one night when he scolded me for missing another business dinner. Because it reflects on both of us, he said calmly, folding his jacket. Or because it messes up your perfect image? He didn't answer. His silence was infuriating because it wasn't indifference. It was control, precision, power disguised as calm. But then I saw his hands tremble slightly when he adjusted his cufflinks. It was the first crack in his armor, and I couldn't stop looking. Weeks passed, and the city started to change for me. I found myself waiting for his footsteps in the hallway, his low voice saying, "Good morning," like it meant something. He'd leave coffee on my desk when I stayed up late painting. He never mentioned it, but he always noticed when I couldn't sleep. The nightmares had been with me for years, dark flashes of my mother's death, of the things my father said were weaknesses. I used to wake up choking on my own breath. But Ethan, he had this way of grounding me, of sitting on the edge of my bed without saying a word. Sometimes he'd just rest his hand on my shoulder until my breathing evened out. Once I asked him why he did it. He just said, "Because someone should." And maybe that was the moment I stopped hating him. There's this thing about people like Ethan, you think they're unbreakable until you see them alone. One night, I found him sitting on the couch in the dark, his laptop open but his eyes unfocused, papers scattered around him. The great Ethan Wright, untouchable lawyer, looking like he'd lost something. I sat down beside him, quiet for once. "Bad day?" I asked. "Just another day," he replied, voice hoarse. Then, softer, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" That hit too close. "Every damn day," I whispered. He turned to me then, and there was something raw in his expression. For the first time, he didn't look composed. He looked human. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were inches apart. The city outside went silent. The air between us burned slow. Then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't planned. It was like a confession, years in the making, of every held breath, every stolen glance. His hands were firm against my jaw, mine tangled in his shirt like I was drowning and he was the only thing real. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he breathed. "I know," I said, "but it did." And maybe for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. But love, especially the forbidden kind, never stays simple for long. My father found out. Of course he died, always does. The confrontation was brutal. Words like embarrassment, shame, and disappointment filled the air until I couldn't breathe. "You'll end this," he ordered. "You'll marry him. Keep your mouth shut, and never let this ruin us." But I couldn't, because somewhere between the arguments and the quiet coffees, I'd fallen in love with Ethan Wright, the man who taught me that even the coldest hearts still crave warmth. That night, I packed my bags. Ethan didn't try to stop me. He just stood by the window, his back turned, his voice low. "If you go," he said, "don't look back." I wanted to say I wouldn't, but I did, because love doesn't fade in silence. It waits. And somehow I knew this wasn't the end. It's funny how quiet a city can be when you've lost someone. New York used to roar sirens, laughter, music leaking from bars, but after I left Ethan, everything felt like background noise to a movie I no longer starred in. I rented a small studio in Brooklyn with cracked walls and a leaky faucet. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I woke up without a schedule, without expectations, without anyone waiting to tell me who I was supposed to be. And still, I couldn't sleep. The nightmares came back worse than before. Sometimes it was my father's voice, cold and sharp as glass. Sometimes it was Ethan's face, looking at me across a table, saying nothing. I'd wake up tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, my heart pounding like I'd run for miles. The therapist I started seeing said I had residual trauma from repression. I laughed when she said it sounded like something Ethan would say if he ever dared to talk about emotions. But she wasn't wrong. Freedom had its own kind of prison. Weeks turned into months. I painted to fill the silence. Portraits, mostly. Shadows of faces I couldn't forget. Sometimes I'd catch myself sketching the curve of Ethan's jaw, the way his brows furrowed when he read. Once, I tore the page in half before I even finished. One afternoon, I got a call from my father's assistant. "Your engagement party photos were published," she said flatly, as if reading a grocery list. "You might want to stay offline for a while." I didn't check. I didn't have to. The deal had gone through. My father got what he wanted, and Ethan probably did too. But there was this ache that didn't make sense. Because even if our relationship started as a contract, somewhere along the way, it had become something real. Something neither of us knew how to handle. It was raining the night I ran into him again. I was coming out of a gallery where I'd managed to get a few paintings displayed at a small, independent space run by a friend who didn't care about names, only emotions on canvas. I was drenched, half drunk on cheap champagne, and fumbling with my umbrella when I saw him, Ethan Wright, standing under the awning of a bookstore across the street, phone pressed to his ear, suit immaculate as ever. My heart stopped. He looked the same and yet different. The edges softer somehow, like the city had worn him down a little. His eyes flicked and met mine. For a heartbeat, everything I'd built to protect myself, walls, bitterness, pride, crumbled. He ended his call and crossed the street without looking away. "Liam," he said when he reached me, rain dotting his hair. His voice was lower, rougher. "You look alive." I let out a shaky laugh. "That's one way to put it. You still look like you bill people for breathing." He smiled, actually smiled, and I hated how much I'd missed that. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us sure what to say next. Finally, he gestured toward the cafe behind me. "Can we talk?" The cafe was nearly empty, warm light spilling across the rain-streaked windows. I sat across from him, wrapping my hands around a mug I didn't drink from. He looked at me like someone cataloging proof of existence. "You've been painting," he said, noticing the smudges of color on my fingernails. "I saw the exhibit poster. Congratulations." "You came?" I asked, surprised. He hesitated, then nodded. "A week ago. Didn't think you'd want to see me." He was right. I didn't. And yet here I was. So, I said finally, breaking the silence. You still engaged? He sighed softly, running a hand through his hair. The engagement's over. Your father canceled it the day you left. The deal didn't need it anymore. I blinked, processing that. So you're free. He looked at me, eyes unreadable. I was never free. I didn't know what to say to that. The Ethan I remembered didn't talk like this. He didn't show cracks. He didn't feel. But the man sitting across from me looked tired, not in a physical way, but in that quiet, soul-deep exhaustion that comes from pretending too long. Why did you come tonight? I asked. To see if you were okay, he said simply. And maybe to apologize. For what? For not fighting harder for you. That hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words got tangled somewhere between anger and forgiveness. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. You don't owe me anything, Liam, but I want you to know that what happened between us wasn't just obligation. I felt it too. The confession cracked something open inside me. I wanted to hate him for being late, for being careful when I'd needed him to be reckless, but I couldn't. Because beneath everything, I still loved him. The rain had stopped by the time we left the cafe. The city shimmered in puddles and reflections, and I almost asked him to walk me home. Almost. But instead, he reached out, brushed a strand of wet hair from my face and said, You deserve peace, Liam, even if it's not with me. I nodded, blinking fast. You too, Ethan. And just like that, we parted again. For a while, I thought that was the end of our story. But New York has a way of pulling threads back together when you least expect it. 2 months later, I got an invitation to a charity gala. The same law firm Ethan worked for was sponsoring an art auction, featuring local painters. One of my pieces had been chosen anonymously by the event curator. It was a portrait called Stillness Before Dawn. I didn't tell anyone, but it was of him. When I walked into the grand hall, I felt his presence before I saw him. He was standing near the stage, surrounded by polished people in tailored suits, his charm back in place like armor. But when our eyes met across the crowd, it fell just for a second. The auction started. My painting was unveiled. There were whispers, a few murmurs of appreciation. The bidding began, and then Ethan raised his paddle. I froze. He didn't stop bidding until the gavel came down in his favor. Afterward, he found me near the exit, holding the painting carefully. I wasn't sure if I had the right to keep this, he said, his voice barely above the music. You bought it fair and square, I said, my throat dry. He smiled faintly. That's not what I meant. Later that night, he walked me home. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and coffee from late-night carts. I'm moving, he said suddenly, to DC. The firm offered me a position with their legal advocacy branch. Different work. More meaningful. I looked at him, surprised. You? Leaving New York? He shrugged, hands in pockets. Maybe it's time I stop building walls for other people and start tearing down a few of my own. Something inside me softened. That sounds like the Ethan I wanted to know. He stopped walking then, turned toward me. You did know him, Liam. You just met him too early. The words lingered between us, heavy and true. I didn't know what to say, so I stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't desperate or dramatic, just quiet, steady, like an acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. He rested his chin on my shoulder, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But he didn't. He just held me. When we pulled apart, there were no promises, no dramatic goodbyes. Just two men standing under a flickering streetlight, finally at peace with what had been and what might still be someday. That night, I slept without nightmares for the first time in years. And in the quiet of my Brooklyn apartment, I finally understood what Ethan had meant all along. Love wasn't about being rescued. It was about being seen for all the broken pieces, all the wrong turns, all the parts we're taught to hide. He taught me that, and even if our paths never crossed again, I knew we'd both carry that lesson wherever we went. Because sometimes, the most honest kind of love isn't the one that lasts forever, it's the one that sets you free. A year can change everything or nothing at all. New York still hummed the same way. Relentless, electric, alive. But for me, it felt quieter. Gentler. Maybe because I'd finally learned how to breathe without waiting for the next storm. I'd opened my own small art studio in Brooklyn, just a sunlit space above a flower shop, where the smell of paint mixed with the scent of roses and wet soil. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I held weekend classes for kids, taught them how to make colors out of mistakes, how to find beauty in imperfection. Sometimes, when I locked up at night, I'd catch myself staring out at the skyline and thinking of him, Ethan Wright, the man who once felt like winter and somehow became my warmth. We hadn't spoken since that night under the streetlight. No calls, no texts, just silence. And yet, there were moments when I swore I could still feel him in the city, the sound of polished shoes on pavement, a voice on a radio ad, a stranger in a suit with his same kind of posture. I told myself I'd moved on. Most days I believed it, until the day he walked back into my life. It was early spring, and the flower shop downstairs had spilled tulips onto the sidewalk, bright red and yellow against the gray concrete. I was finishing a painting, something abstract, something that felt like closure, when the bell above my studio door rang. "Sorry, we're closed," I called without turning around. "I was hoping you'd make an exception," came a voice I hadn't heard in 12 months. My brush slipped from my hand. I turned. He stood there, Ethan, older by a year but somehow lighter, like he'd been carrying less weight. His hair was a bit longer, his expression softer. Gone was the perfect three-piece armor. He wore a simple coat, dark jeans, a navy scarf that looked human, not corporate. My chest tightened. "You?" I whispered. "Me," he said, smiling slightly. "Hi, Liam." The word hi shouldn't have hurt, but it did. I didn't move, just stared. "I thought you were in DC. "I was," he said, stepping inside. "Still am, technically. But I'm here on a case. And maybe something else." He glanced around the studio, eyes moving over the paintings on the walls, pieces of me he'd never seen before. "This is yours," he said quietly, almost in awe. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's not a penthouse view, but it's enough." He smiled, genuine this time. "It's more than enough." The silence stretched, full of words neither of us dared to touch. Finally, I asked, "So, why are you really here, Ethan?" He met my gaze, steady and sure. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. And because I made a mistake letting you walk away." I wanted to say something clever, something that would keep my heart safe. But the truth had a way of slipping past defenses when it came to him. "I thought you were done with me," I said. He shook his head. "I was never done. I was just too afraid to want something I couldn't control." I laughed bitterly. "Control was your favorite hobby." "I know," he said softly. "And it cost me you." His voice cracked on the last word, and that did it. The wall I'd built all year, the sarcasm, the calm, the pretending crumbled in an instant. "Do you have any idea what that year was like?" I asked, my throat tightening. "I kept painting your face. I'd wake up reaching for you and hate myself for it. I told everyone I was over you, but every time it rained, I remembered that night." He took a step closer, eyes glimmering. "I remember it too. Another step, and another, until he was right in front of me, the smell of rain and coffee clinging to his coat. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I came because I finally understood what love is supposed to be. It's not perfect. It's not safe. It's showing up anyway." I swallowed hard. "And what if I can't trust you not to leave again?" He exhaled, trembling just slightly. "Then let me stay until you can." Something inside me broke and mended at the same time. Without thinking, I reached up and touched his cheek. His skin was warm beneath my fingers. Real, solid, everything I'd missed. "You really came back," I whispered. "I never left," he murmured. "I just took the long way home." And then he kissed me. It wasn't desperate this time. It wasn't a storm. It was soft, steady, a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The kind of kiss that said, "I see you. I'm not running anymore." When we pulled apart, the world felt different, clearer, simpler. Stay for dinner, I said, voice barely above a whisper. He smiled. Only if you promise not to burn it this time. I laughed, the sound breaking through the last of the pain. No promises. We ate takeout on the studio floor, surrounded by half-finished canvases and paint stains. He told me about DC, about how he'd left corporate law and joined a nonprofit defending queer youth from discrimination. How it felt terrifying and freeing all at once. You'd be proud of me, he said, smiling shyly. I already am, I replied. Later, as the city lights flickered outside, we sat in silence, our shoulders brushing. It felt like the first real quiet I'd ever known. Do you still have nightmares? He asked gently. Sometimes, I admitted, but they don't scare me anymore. He looked at me, his expression soft. Why not? Because now, when I wake up, I said, leaning into him, I know I'm not alone. Spring turned to summer. Ethan started splitting his time between DC and New York, renting an apartment not far from my studio. He'd work during the day, I'd paint, and at night we'd meet on my rooftop, the same kind of rooftop where we first stood years ago, only now there was no distance, no pretense. Sometimes, he'd fall asleep with his head on my lap, exhaustion softening his sharp edges. I'd run my fingers through his hair and think about how strange life was, how love can start from something forced, broken, and still grow into something honest. One night, he looked up at me and said, Do you ever wonder if we were meant to meet this way? Through all that mess. I smiled. Maybe the mess was the only way we'd ever see each other for real. He nodded, thoughtful. Then I guess I should thank your father. I laughed. Let's not go that far. Months later, on a chilly October evening, I came home to find the studio lit by candles. Soft jazz played from the old speaker. Ethan stood there in his favorite gray sweater, holding something behind his back. My heart skipped. What's going on? He smiled nervously. You once told me you never wanted another contract controlling your life, so I thought we'd write our own. He handed me a small leather-bound book. Inside, written in his neat handwriting, were words that weren't vows but promises. Simple ones. I promise to listen, even when silence feels safer. I promise not to fix you, just to stand beside you while you heal. I promise to leave the light on when the nightmares come. I looked up, tears stinging my eyes. Ethan, he took my hand. You don't have to say anything now. Just if you ever decide you want forever, I'll be right here. And for once, I didn't hesitate. I leaned in and whispered, Then I guess you should stay. A year later, we stood together on that same rooftop, the skyline stretching before us. The wind carried the sound of traffic and laughter, life happening below. Ethan slipped his arm around my waist, pressing a kiss to my temple. You still having nightmares? Not the bad kind, I said, smiling. Now they're just dreams. He chuckled. What about? I looked out over the city that had witnessed every version of us, the strangers, the enemies, the lovers, the survivors. About this, I said softly. About us finally getting it right. He tightened his hold, his breath warm against my ear. Then let's make sure we never wake up. And there, under the endless sky of New York, with the world spinning below us, I realized something I'd been chasing all my life. Peace doesn't come when everything is perfect. It comes when you're finally with the person who makes even the broken pieces feel whole. That night, as we fell asleep together for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of the past. Only of a quiet morning, sunlight spilling across his face, his hand reaching for mine under the sheets. For once, there were no nightmares, only love. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.